The Differently Brained team acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we record, edit, and stream this podcast. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples and their elders past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to all First Nations cultures and their ongoing connection to the lands, waterways, and communities. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome to Differently Brained, the podcast where no brain is the same. I'm Jacinta Dietrich.
And I'm allegedly Lachlan Rutherford. And today we're having an interview with the wonderful Chelsea Luca, who is an inspiring role model, master in her domain, and an all-round lovely person. She runs her own psychology practice, Connector Psychology, in the neuroaffirming space. As an autistic ADHDer herself, working towards a world that is inclusive and understanding. Her new middle grade title, Square Me Round World, is a collection of stories brought together by her own experiences of growing up feeling different in fun, imaginative, and eye-opening ways. Chelsea's work aims to empower readers to acknowledge and embrace differences, implement self-care, draw on their own individual strengths and challenges, and to foster genuine connections and well-being by appreciating everyone's authentic selves. Chelsea, thank you so much for coming on to our show today.
Thanks for having me. It sounds like it's going to be fun.
I hope so. I really do. So just to get started, your intro kind of gives the game away a little bit, but could you tell us a little bit about your neurodivergent identity, what it means to you to be an ADHDer?
Spoiler alert, wasn't it? It's okay. We like good spoiler alert. I always read the plot of a movie before I watch it because, that's part of my autistic brain.
There you go.
So that's a nice lead in, really. So yes, I am an autistic ADHDer, and I guess it's been a bit of a journey to, discover my own neurotype. I guess like very, very, very many people out there, I kind of only cottoned on once I recognized that my own children were neurodivergent. And given that one of my children is a carbon copy of myself, it wasn't a very large leap to go, oh, right, okay, well, if that's what's going on here, then that's what's also going on there. Yeah. So, in there, I would say very autistic way, I researched everything that there was to know about autism and ADHD. Luckily, it had already been a special interest of mine. Yeah, I think it just really continued in the way it was probably already going. I guess being an autistic ADHD for me is a life of being consistently inconsistent. I think, there's glorious parts about my autism and how I experience being autistic in terms of deep diving into interests and liking to know, all of the things about those things and being so passionate about the things that I'm interested in. But then there's also the ADHD brain, which wants to do 7 million things at once and has a slight habit of overestimating how many things can be achieved in a single day. And, it's just a really delightful combination, which is full of ups and downs, I think.
All very relatable, very much so, yes.
Yeah, Jacinta, I was just listening to you then, Chelsea. I am thinking back to stuff that Jacinta said on the podcast and just to me in general, like, yeah, this sounds about similar, really.
Yeah, I think, there's so many delightful nuances to the autistic and the ADHD neurotypes that we are learning more and more about, as we come to understand them more as neurotypes and not, as they've previously been framed in terms of being disorders or under that medical model. I think as we start to understand them more as neurotypes, we get to really see, how broad they are and how differently they present across different individuals.
Yeah.
But yes, there are a lot of similarities as well.
For listeners who might not have come across the term before, can you explain briefly what a neurotype is?
Certainly can. So a neurotype is a type of brain. So We have neurotypical brains, which are, said to be the most common type of brain. And then we have neurodivergent brains, and they are brains that diverge from the typical brain. And so, neurotypes, there is a whole wide range of neurotypes. There's the autistic neurotype, there's an ADHD neurotype, there's the autistic ADHD neurotype. Then we add in the whole umbrella of what sits under neurodivergence. And, we'd be here all day if we were listing them all. But yeah, it's just this really beautiful wide rainbow of different neurotypes and different types of brains.
Is that something, because you're a psychologist, is that something that you learn about in studying psychology, or is that something that you've come to understand? Yeah, I thought that might be the answer. So it's something that you've come to understand through your own research, really.
Look, I would love to think that this will be really key learning moving forward in psychology training. I think, we're definitely seeing progress in terms of the way things are understood. Unfortunately, I don't think we're quite at the point where, there's enough information being provided in terms of neurodivergence, in terms of understanding brains as a natural variation in brain types rather than, kind of going, as I said, with that really medical model way of looking at things. But, I do think there is some growth happening. I certainly hope the growth happens faster and, more broadly. But yeah, I would say that the predominant learning in this space has really been out of uni, and it's been self-driven, as I said, by my particular interest in autism and ADHD and the neurodiversity affirming movement.
Right. So your interest being in ADHD and autism, and also, the lack of, I guess, research information, whatever, in that area, is that kind of what led you to create Connector Psychology? And could you tell us a little bit about Connector Psychology?
Sure can. So I was working with a number of autistic and ADHD clients before, building my own practice. And I decided that, as a natural progression to try and suit my own needs a little bit more and also the needs of having young kiddos, I was going to open my own practice. And I really wanted, in opening my own practice, to create a space that not only accommodated my needs, but really was accommodating and inclusive and welcoming for all different sorts of needs. And connection has always been something that is so incredibly important to me, and I believe is incredibly important to humankind in general. And so, that word was also a real driver for me in terms of just wanting to create, a space where people were able to feel connected and were able to feel like they had that sense of belonging. So that kind of is what drove me to starting my own practice, and things have kind of just grown from there in terms of, what that kind of looks like on a day-to-day basis, particularly when you have an ADHD brain that decides that you should do all of the things and doesn't stop.
And what differentiates Connector Psychology from other practices?
Well, I very rarely wear shoes, which I guess is probably not super common. So I have really set up my clinic to be sensory friendly in terms of that accommodates my needs, but it also accommodates the needs of most people, who come into the clinic. So, we don't use the big light, we have nice lamps, and, we have squishy mats, and we have bean bags, we have alternative seating, we have fidgets everywhere. We really, I guess I try to encourage authenticity and people showing up the way that they need to show up at that time, whether that means they're lying on the floor for the whole session, whether that means they're pacing, whether that means, they're sitting in a beanbag. And I've found that just allows people to at least have one space where they feel safe to be themselves and feel like they can really drop that mask and connect with what their body actually genuinely needs.
I think that's so wonderful. And I think it's still so rare, very much like you were talking about, you know, the learning gap and the difference between, you know, what is taught and then what we actually do know kind of thing. I think it's still relatively rare to find neuroaffirming spaces like that where you can just be your full self. And if you don't want to wear shoes, if you want to lay on the ground, all that kind of thing, that you do that anywhere else, it's absolutely frowned upon and all that stuff. So it's really wonderful to hear that there are little spaces dotted around and that you're giving that to other people.
There's certainly, not as many as I would hope there would be. And it is quite tricky because I definitely exist in a little neuroaffirming bubble. So I face kind of a harsh shock reality when I step outside of that space, because a lot of the spaces that I move in are really neurodiversity affirming. But yeah, I found that it just makes such a difference, you know, having a space where people can feel comfortable and feel like they can, you know, communicate in whatever way they need to communicate. Maybe they need to write down, you know, what's going on. Maybe they need to draw. Maybe they need to communicate via emojis, or we find memes that kind of represent for them what's going on. I think the more we can create spaces where that happens, the more people are able to recognize what it is that they need and be able to try and advocate for that outside of that space.
Yeah, which is absolutely, I find the same thing of my house is very much set up for me, and the spaces that I go are generally, you know, very neuroaffirming, and whether it's, you know, family or friends, those are places that I feel safe, that I've got that flexibility, and, you know, it's been set up so that big lights aren't overwhelming and stuff like that. And it is a shock when you go into a space that is not as accommodating or flexible. Yeah, I definitely relate to that.
Yes.
How did you get into psychology? I assume that psychology, this is probably maybe an incorrect assumption, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I assume that psychology came before Kidlets and your diagnosis?
Psychology did, but, you know, as we say, neurotypes are from birth. I have always been an autistic ADHD brain, and unfortunately, growing up as an autistic ADHDer without information as to that you are an autistic ADHDer and that there is a reason that maybe your experience isn't quite the same as everyone around you. I think that a lot of autistic ADHDers start to become experts on human behaviour as a form of survival. And so, you know, I would certainly say that I have been thoroughly interested in human behaviour, you know, from probably a very young age. And so, you know, when it came time to decide what I was going to do with my life, I think that psychology was always pretty high up there. I actually also studied criminology, so I don't know if it was like I was kind of tossing up, you know, do I go down a life of crime or do I go, you know, be a psychologist? But it was a really fun combo, and I think that was also driven by an interest at the time in sort of crime fiction TV shows. Sounded very appealing. It didn't quite look like that in real life, unfortunately. But yeah, I've always been interested in human behaviour. I've always been interested in trying to understand communication, in trying to understand social relationships and connections and how people form connections and build connections. So yeah, I think that led me quite naturally to psychology. I think that then being, you know, in the university environment and being, I guess, studying psychology in maybe not such a neurodiversity affirming way, that was quite tricky sometimes. But, you know, once I was able to kind of put my own flavour on things, it became enjoyable again.
It makes complete sense because, like you said, it's essentially hardwired that in a society where you are different, you are the minority, of course you're spending all your time like looking at everyone else's behavior. Like you said, it's a survival thing. And it's almost second nature, I guess. And for that to then become, you know, a passion and a focus, yeah, absolutely. It's a natural development, I kind of see.
Yeah.
being a autistic ADHD psychologist, how do you balance your needs and the needs of your, I don't know what word you use, clients or people who come to you? How do you make sure that, everybody's needs are met and you look after you still?
So I am huge on self-compassion. I found compassion-focused therapy a few years ago now, and really embraced compassion-focused therapy as a modality that really resonated with me. And what compassion-focused therapy is all about is about having understanding and practicing kindness and compassion for yourself in relation to that understanding. And so for me, modeling self-compassion, modeling self-advocacy, modeling acceptance of myself is, I think, one of the most important things I can do for my clients. And so, I actively will say, I need to move, I need to shift space, I need to sit somewhere different, or I need a blanket on right now, or actually I need to change fidgets, or I've lost a word in the middle of talking, so I'm going to try and mime it to you and see if you can guess what I'm trying to say. I very commonly am quite authentic and model those sort of things to my clients to give them the permission to do it for themselves, but to also, provide an example of what it might look like to actually do those things.
That's so beautiful, and what just a wonderful answer. I think there's so much of, people in general who don't have self-compassion. There's a lot of self-love missing in the world.
Are you outing us, Jacinta, with that comment?
No, I was just saying, I think that is a really general thing. So to, meet the needs of others by advocating for yourself and showing yourself compassion and all of that, I think is just so wholesome and just so lovely. I'm just like, oh my God, I can't even. That's, wow. I think that's really unique. That's something that, obviously we really struggle with the Differently Brain team. We are not very self-compassionate. And so to have the reminder that, doing that stuff for you helps pave the way for other people to do stuff for themselves. It's a really nice way to think about it, I think. And for people who struggle with self-compassion, who maybe feel like they need permission or they need to, do it for someone else, it's like a gateway into it. Like, I'm being nice to me so that someone else will be nice to themselves.
And that's where we usually start, is that, really, really big struggles with self-compassion are very common, particularly in neurodivergent individuals, because you've essentially grown up in a world that has fueled your critical self. The world has given you all of the language that your critical self needs. So that's obviously what's sitting on the top there. So it actually takes active practice and the ability to actively practice being compassionate to yourself. And so, I think that the awareness that, gosh, I don't have this. This is really hard. This feels unnatural. They're the thoughts I have if I ever decide I'm going to do exercise, because let's face it, it's not a comfort area of mine and probably never will be. But if I decided I would commit to it, and if I practiced, it would get easier and I would get better at it. Self-compassion is exactly the same. It's building those new pathways in your brain, and it's making those pathways stronger every single time you do it. And I think part of self-compassion is also saying, hey, I'm actually beating myself up right now. Gosh, that's so frustrating that I'm still doing that, even with all of this practice that I'm doing. And so, this is where we can be reminding ourselves that finding it hard to be self-compassionate is actually being compassionate to ourselves.
That's actually a really good point, because that's the thing. When I find myself struggling with self-compassion, which is always, I'll get to that point of going, I'm beating up on myself too much. This is the situation that I'm in. But instead of taking that as me being self-compassionate, I just kind of write it off as like noise, I guess. It's just me. It's just me thinking like, you're getting in the way of what needs to be done, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Because that's what we've all been trained. That's how we've
Yes.
all been trained in a society that values productivity, in a society that values push through everything. You'll be fine, just keep pushing through. It's hard to grow those voices that say, actually, this is really hard. And, I can see that this is really hard for you. And of course, you're responding this way. How could you not respond that way?
Yeah. Complete subject, well, not even a complete subject change, but definitely an important subject change. You've written a book. Yes, Square Me Round World. Could you tell us a little bit about this book?
Oh my goodness, yes. So it also has a delightfully autistic ADHD beginning, which I'm sure you'll love as well. So I started writing the book when I was down in Melbourne last year for the Yellow Ladybugs conference. So for anyone who doesn't know the Yellow Ladybugs, they are a beautiful Australian organisation that supports autistic girls and women. And while I was down there, I met some people who I had been talking to online for quite a while but had never seen them in real life. And I connected with them so easily, and it was so easy and so just enjoyable and calming to be, in these people's presence. And so at midnight, when I was in my hotel room asleep, I woke up and decided that I would write a story on my mobile phone. And that ended up being the second chapter of Square Me Round World. I proceeded to write 6 more stories on my mobile phone at various times, generally in the middle of the night, whenever inspiration struck. And, they were only ever intended to be, maybe little stories I might share with clients, about different experiences of growing up in a world that you don't feel like it was built for you. And a few people read them and kind of were saying, you should publish this, And I was like, yeah, whatever. Then I very impulsively decided I was going to publish it. And it was a very slippery slope to learning. Apparently there's all these steps involved in publishing a book that my brain didn't quite think through when I first initially impulsively decided, yep, I'm going to do it. But then, luckily my autistic brain was like, you need to learn all of these steps very well. You need to make an Excel spreadsheet. You need to follow them with detail and precision, even though this is not your job. You're a psychologist. I apparently did all the steps and then ended up with this pretty cool book at the end of it. So essentially what it is, it's a collection of 7 short stories, and the stories kind of all describe different parts of what life can be like, not necessarily just for autistic ADHDers, but certainly, I think a lot of autistic ADHDers will probably relate to some of the experiences. So, there's a story about feeling different. There's a story about making friends, in a little bit different way. There's a story about masking. There's one about autistic burnout, sensory overload, finding it hard to fall asleep, those sort of things. And the main driver, I guess, was I wanted there to be resources about people's experiences that were just fun stories, and really low demand and not overly in people's face in terms of this is your brain, but more stories that people could connect with who may not connect with a lot of stuff in sort of the mainstream literature.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why we did this show, is because we wanted to have, similar to with your book, have a resource that is a bit more low-key, a bit more kind of like story-based, experience-based, to allow people to understand the situation without it being a clinical framework, I suppose.
Yeah.
And one thing that I really appreciated as well about Square Me Round World is you've got a free information guide on your website, which basically yeah, it serves as like a glossary, well, way more than a glossary of all the different terms and ideas and terminologies and stuff that you use in that book, which I think would be such a great resource for like neurotypical people
Yeah.
or people who aren't necessarily in the know to get caught up on the words, on the terminology.
Yeah, definitely. And that was, the intention was, I wanted to create the feeling of people being seen and the feeling of people being represented and the feeling of people being able to, maybe put words to their own experiences that they maybe hadn't had. But on the, other side, I wanted people to be able to, understand these experiences outside of the textbook understanding, outside of, that really medical model way of understanding, people understanding the experiences more in a day-to-day kind of, oh, wow, is that what life is like for you? And introducing, maybe a broader audience to the world of being neurodiversity affirming and what that actually means. And, definitely giving, potentially parents or therapists or educators, those insights to be able to help them to support the people that they're supporting.
Yeah, I think it's such a fabulous resource for all those different parents and educators for sure. I also love that you just started writing it on your phone. I think that is just like so relatable of just like, well, I was at the Yellow Ladybugs conference and I got excited and so I started writing a book on my phone.
Yeah.
Like that just absolutely. And it makes me so happy that, you kept going with it and that it is now a real book and things like that, because that's so exciting. One, because it's brilliant and I love it and it means so much and it's going to do so much for so many people, but also that like it made it out of the notes app. Like so many things have gone. Yeah, so many things have died in my notes app that I like scroll back when I'm cleaning up and I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. And it's so nice to see something make it out of the doom pile.
it made it out begrudgingly. I did decide I should get it edited by a professional editor, and she didn't seem so keen on working on a mobile phone text messages. So begrudgingly was transferred to my computer at that stage. But I love that it has a cool story. I'm like, gosh, wouldn't it be like so much less interesting if it didn't have a cool story? And it's such a classically autistic ADHD story as well. I'm just like, it's so on brand. It's just chef's kiss. I'm just like, yes, I'm so glad. Yeah, I think it was really nice that something did make it out. And it was really nice that I learned this whole different profession, that apparently, there are lots of steps and layers too. But I also was like, well, see, if you put your mind to it, sometimes it happens.
Absolutely. I also love that it's a collection of short stories. I think that's a really accessible way to do it. I think it's really beautiful and it allowed you to, look at those different experiences and things like that. Was that because that was essentially kind of how it came out, or was that something that when you were playing around with it, you decided, no, I want it to be a collection rather than, one big old book of one story?
Yeah, I think that's also leaning into my brain, in that probably sustaining one long story I would probably get bored halfway and stop writing. So I think it's a way to be accessible to myself writing it, but also to be accessible to the readers, in that it's hard to pay attention, for a long period of time, and it's hard to retain information in your brain for extended periods of time. So, having some short stories where you can kind of capture a big idea in a short space of time, I felt like that was a really accessible way of presenting these ideas. And then, I thought that putting all of these ideas and short stories together in one lot, would also then give the, experience of being able to have a look at a whole range of different experiences rather than just maybe one experience.
I think that's really valuable. And I think when you're trying to tell neurodivergent stories, you know, if you've only got one character or if you've only got one story, there's a lot of pressure on that one individual thing or person to represent like a whole community.
Yeah.
Whereas if you break it down and you show different angles and different characters, different stories, different experiences, it's way more inclusive.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, obviously there's a whole community and not everyone is the same, obviously. And so I think it was a really clever way to reach out and reach a lot of people rather than maybe only showing, you know, one way of being neurodivergent kind of
Yeah,
thing.
it avoids
I love that.
treating it as a monolith rather than
Yeah. And I really wanted to avoid it being really tokenistic, because I think that's what can also happen sometimes is when people, you know, have these really great intentions and they sometimes end up creating this really stereotypical character, you know, this really character based on really outdated, you know, information, or they try and, as you said, fit all of the things into one person and their experiences, you know, which then kind of makes it unrelatable rather than relatable.
Yeah. That's actually a really good segue into our last question, which is my favorite question to ask. So often representations of neurodivergent people or people with mental illness do fall into that trap of being tokenistic. What I want to know, and what Jacinta wants to know, and what the audience wants to know is if you know of any really good, nuanced, well-rounded, well-fleshed out representations of ADHDs that you've come across in your life. And that can be, you know, any kind of media, but it can also be resources alongside your amazing book as well.
Gosh, that's a huge question. Just keep it really simple and straightforward. Look, in terms of, I guess, mainstream media, I think that there is actually some really nice, nuanced presentations that they just haven't actually named as being autistic ADHD. I think that, you know, the more that we start to understand these neurotypes, and the more, I guess, we start to understand that people's internal experiences can look quite different to their external behaviors, and that goes with mental health as well. You know, I think that there's a lot more nuance than, you know, has really been highlighted, and so I think that there actually is some really good representation in I guess, in different characters in TV shows and in movies and things like that just haven't been explicitly identified, you know, by the neurotypes that they probably have. I guess in terms of good representation, we're starting to see a lot more lived experience in terms of people writing, you know, books about their own experiences, or, you know, creating social media accounts about their own experiences. So I would definitely say the more we can kind of lean into lived experience, the more we're going to really get that nuanced understanding that there's a whole rainbow of experiences under the neurodivergence umbrella, and that can present and be experienced so differently by a range of different individuals. I guess in terms of places that I would go in terms of trying to, you know, get more information or get more understanding, you know, there's some really great organisations that are really stepping up in terms of the Australian space and neurodiversity affirming practice and those sort of things. You know, we've got the Yellow Ladybugs, who I already mentioned. Reframing Autism is a really great organisation as well. They have just an absolutely amazing amount of information, and that's growing rapidly. So, you know, they're two really great Australian organisations. We also have the ICANN network in Australia, which is really great in terms of providing spaces for autistic people to connect with each other. In terms of resources, I probably would be here all day because I have quite the collection of resources that I have, of course, organised by subjects, and the tab selection is very long on my computer. So, look, I think there's a whole range of really great neurodiversity affirming resources that are becoming available that do give more of a nuanced understanding of those neurotypes. I would like to see that happen more, outside of the just autistic ADHD space.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we still need a far bigger focus on autism and ADHD, because clearly we're nowhere near where we need to be. But I think so often when people say neurodivergent, they use that as a word to actually mean autistic or ADHD, when we know that being neurodivergent is so much broader than that.
Yeah.
And I guess as we come to understand different experiences under that neurodivergent umbrella, I think that we're going to get, a far broader understanding of humans experiencing life as humans, but a little bit differently than we have at the moment. I hope that made sense.
Fantastic answer. And a fantastic way to, a nice quotable quote to end the show with. It's great. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking with us today and for sharing so much of yourself and everything that you do.
Yeah.
It means so much to have people out there advocating for themselves, for other people. And the book is just absolutely gorgeous. Everyone should go and get it because it is just a wonderful resource.
Thank you.
We'll have links to all the things mentioned, well, as much as we can in the show notes, as well as a link to Chelsea's website, connectuspsychology.com. So, yeah, thank you so much, Chelsea, for coming along and having a chat with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a delightfully tangential chat, as are the best of them.
Indeed.
But yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Amazing.
No
Thank you. And we'll have another episode for all you differently brained listeners in a week's time.
See ya.
Differently Brained shares the opinions of individuals and does not consider your personal circumstances. Differently Brained exists purely for information purposes and should not be relied on as health or medical advice. Because no brain is the same, please consult your healthcare professional for your personal medical needs.